The sea was calm beneath the gray morning sky of October 1944. Out beyond the smoke drifting over Leyte Gulf, a U.S. destroyer rolled in the swell, its crew weary from days of battle. The radar picked up a speck approaching fast from the east. Moments later, the lookout saw it. A single zero, diving low, sunlight flashing off its wings. Inside the ship, alarms wailed. Men rushed to the guns. The pilot in the Japanese plane gripped the control stick tightly, eyes fixed on the American ship below. His fuel tank was nearly empty. His heart was steady. He had sworn an oath to die for his emperor. The destroyer's 5-inch guns elevated, the director locked on. One shell screamed upward, a new kind of weapon, one that carried invisible power inside. It never touched the plane. Instead, a white flash erupted midair. The Zero shattered, its wings torn apart by a shockwave of metal and fire. The fragments fell harmlessly into the sea. On deck, sailors stared in disbelief. They had seen many dives end in flames before, but never like this. One man whispered, "It exploded before it hit." It wasn't luck. It was science, unseen, deadly, and revolutionary. By the end of 1944, the Empire of Japan was bleeding. The war that had begun in triumph across the Pacific was turning into a slow, unstoppable collapse. American submarines strangled supply lines. Bombers reached deep into cities once thought untouchable. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Emperor, had been broken in battles across the Central Pacific, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and now the Philippines. Every island lost brought the Americans closer. Every defeat cut deeper into Japan's hope of survival. In the ruins of this fading empire, a new weapon was born. Not from science or machinery, but from belief. Its name was kamikaze. Divine wind. The same word once used for the typhoon that saved Japan from Mongol invasion, and centuries before. Now, it carried a new meaning. Men who would become the wind themselves, crashing their planes into enemy ships in acts of self-sacrifice. The first waves came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japan's high command, desperate to halt the American advance, turned to the only thing it still possessed in abundance: young men ready to die. Pilots, many barely trained, were gathered from bases across the home islands. They were told that their deaths would save Japan, that one man's spirit could be stronger than steel. To these men, it wasn't suicide. It was duty. The Bushido Code taught them that dying in service to the emperor was the highest honor. In small wooden barracks, they wrote farewell letters, often ending with phrases like, "I go gladly as a cherry blossom falls." Some posed for photographs beside their planes, smiling faintly, while others tied white headbands marked with the rising sun. Behind those calm faces were sons, brothers, and friends, all heading toward an end they believed would redeem their nation's shame. When the kamikaze attacks began, they stunned the Americans. The first strikes tore into the escort carriers St. Lo and Kalinan Bay, setting decks ablaze and sending men into the sea. On the radio, desperate voices shouted warnings. "Suicide planes! They're diving right into us!" The U.S. Navy had faced fierce enemies before, but this was something new. No evasive maneuver could shake off a pilot who didn't intend to return. Over the next weeks, kamikazes became the nightmare of every sailor in the Pacific. Ships that had survived torpedoes and bombs were now crippled by men who turned their aircraft into human-guided missiles. The sky above the fleet became a place of dread. Each radar blip might mean a man willing to die. For many American crews, it felt like fighting ghosts. The Japanese High Command watched with grim satisfaction as damage reports flooded in. Though the losses were heavy, each sunken ship seemed to prove that faith could still wound the giant across the ocean. The kamikaze strategy spread quickly, from the Philippines to Okinawa, from small airstrips carved into jungles to carriers still afloat in Tokyo Bay. Each young pilot was told the same message: one plane, one ship, one sacrifice to save the nation. But behind the rising number of attacks, cracks were already forming. Japan was running out of fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. Many kamikazes reached their targets with engines sputtering or controls damaged by American fighters. Some never found the enemy at all, disappearing into the sea or drifting aimlessly over the waves. Still, for those who did, the result was horrific. American destroyers, cruisers, and carriers burned from direct impacts. Men were trapped below decks as fires spread through ammunition stores. Survivors would later describe the attacks as the closest thing to hell we ever saw. By late 1944, the kamikaze had become both a weapon and a symbol of Japan's desperation and of the terrifying power of conviction. To stop them, the United States needed something beyond courage or armor. They needed a weapon that could strike faster than human reflex, one that could destroy a plane before it reached the fleet. And so, even as Japanese pilots prepared to give their lives in faith, a secret American invention was quietly being loaded into the GU of the Pacific Fleet, an invisible counterforce to the divine wind. The kamikaze threat spread like wildfire across the Pacific. Every week brought new reports of ships hit, men lost, and aircraft diving from the clouds in suicidal precision. The U.S. Navy's confidence, forged through years of victory, began to crack under the psychological strain. On the horizon, plumes of smoke marked the graves of ships that had seemed indestructible. Destroyers, carriers, transports, none were safe. The closer the Americans came to Japan, the more desperate and deadly the skies became. By December 1944, the Navy had a name for this kind of warfare: kamikaze season. Gunners slept at their posts. Radar operators scanned constantly for low-flying dots. Commanders began reinforcing picket lines far from the main fleet, using smaller ships to absorb the first wave of suicide planes. But no amount of bravery could change the math. A kamikaze moving at 400 miles per hour, closing in from 1,000 yards, left less than 5 seconds to fire, aim, and kill. Often that wasn't enough. American anti-aircraft fire filled the air with smoke and steel. The 5-inch guns, the Bofors, the Oerlikons, they thundered day and night. Thousands of shells were fired for every plane brought down. Yet still, some made it through. Each successful kamikaze strike was another reminder that courage and gunpowder alone could not defend the fleet. In secret laboratories and testing ranges thousands of miles away, scientists had been working on a solution, a weapon that could make those 5 seconds count. It was known as the proximity fuse, or the VT fuse. Instead of detonating only on impact, it would sense its target through tiny radio waves, exploding when it came close enough to tear it apart. The idea was revolutionary: a miniature radar inside a shell. Developed by American and British scientists, the VT fuse was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. If the enemy discovered how it worked, they might learn to jam or copy it. Even within the Navy, only a few officers knew the full details. The first versions had been tested in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain, and later on the battlefields of Europe. But its greatest test would come over the Pacific, against a weapon no one had ever faced before. The challenge wasn't only technological. Commanders had to decide when and where to risk revealing this new shell. If it failed, it could waste precious ammunition and expose the secret. If it worked, it might save the fleet. The balance of the Pacific War depended on that gamble. By late 1944, shipments of the new 5-inch VT shells began arriving aboard U.S. Navy destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. Each shell was a small miracle of engineering, containing vacuum tubes, circuits, and batteries that activated the moment it was fired. It could detect a moving plane within a few yards and detonate at the perfect moment. To the sailors who loaded them, they looked no different from ordinary shells. Only a handful knew that these were the first weapons capable of thinking, in a way no human gunner could. The first time they were used, few understood what had happened. A kamikaze came in low, diving toward a destroyer at dawn. The gunner fired, expecting another near miss. Instead, the shell exploded, just beside the plane, ripping it apart mid-air. The men cheered, but no one outside that ship was told why it had worked so perfectly. Orders from high command demanded silence. As more ships received the VT fuse, its effect began to show. Kamikazes that once seemed unstoppable were now breaking apart before reaching their targets. The Navy had finally found a way to fight an enemy who didn't fear death, with a weapon that didn't need to. But in the vastness of the Pacific, the kamikazes kept coming. For every plane destroyed, another took its place. Japan had turned its final resource, human lives, into a weapon of the skies. The stage was set for the final battles, where faith and science would meet in the smoke above Okinawa. As the seas burned and the skies filled with fire, both sides faced the same question. How do you fight an enemy who no longer fears death? The human angle of the kamikaze attacks begins with the pilots themselves. These were young men, often barely out of their teens, plucked from flight schools across Japan. Their training was brief, sometimes only weeks, yet the expectation was absolute. Fly straight, strike the enemy, and never return. Many kept diaries or wrote letters in the hours before departure, their words a mixture of devotion, resignation, and fear. Some expressed pride, others sorrow for the families they would leave behind. The act of flying into a battleship was not just a military tactic. It was the culmination of a culture steeped in honor and self-sacrifice. The Japanese military portrayed it as a noble mission, a final offering to the emperor. For the pilots, there was a clarity in the simplicity of their task. The world beyond the cockpit no longer mattered. This human commitment created a psychological weapon as potent as any cannon or torpedo. The Americans knew they faced not just aircraft, but a force willing to die to achieve their mission, a factor that made every engagement unpredictable and terrifying. The technological angle, however, provided a counterbalance. The United States' development of the VT fuse was a quiet revolution. Encased in ordinary-looking 5-inch shells, the fuse contained radar circuitry that detected an approaching aircraft. The shell did not need to strike to kill. It detonated when it came close enough to tear a plane apart with a controlled burst of shrapnel. This innovation addressed the central problem of traditional anti-aircraft fire: human reaction time. Even the most skilled gunners could not reliably hit a plane traveling hundreds of miles per hour on a steep dive. With the VT fuse, the shell effectively thought for the crew, bridging the gap between human limitations and the speed of modern aerial attack. Early tests showed near-perfect accuracy against training targets, yet there remained skepticism in some quarters. Could a small radar inside a shell really outperform thousands of hours of gunnery experience? Pacific Fleet commanders would soon find out. Tactically, the kamikaze presented unique challenges. Traditional naval formations relied on layered defenses, picket lines of destroyers to detect and intercept threats, screening cruisers to provide anti-aircraft fire, and carriers stationed in the center of the fleet. Kamikazes forced a re-evaluation of these tactics. Sailors had to understand the trajectory and speed of a suicide plane, coordinating multiple guns, to create a lethal zone of fire. Radar became indispensable, and ships began to fire preemptively, forming a curtain of explosions above the fleet. Every maneuver was a calculated gamble. If one destroyer moved incorrectly, it could expose the fleet to a successful dive. The tactical doctrine of the U.S. Navy was evolving in real time, shaped by both the enemy's will to die and the new technologies arriving to meet it. Leadership played a decisive role in this deadly chess game. On the American side, admirals like William Halsey and Raymond Spruance had to balance offensive operations with the protection of their fleets. Spruance, commanding at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, emphasized the importance of radar coordination and the judicious use of destroyers and picket lines. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, credited as the father of the kamikaze, orchestrated the deployment of volunteer pilots with meticulous attention. He understood the psychological impact these attacks could have, both on American sailors and on Japanese morale. Command decisions shaped the timing, scale, and execution of each wave, often determining whether an assault resulted in chaos or failure. Leadership became a measure not of personal courage, but of understanding the interplay between man, machine, and technology. The enemy angle cannot be ignored. Kamikaze pilots represented an extreme adaptation to strategic desperation. Japan's conventional air power had been decimated, leaving few trained pilots and minimal fuel. By choosing human-guided attacks, the Japanese created a force multiplier. Even a small number of planes could inflict massive damage. Yet this tactic was also inherently limited. Losses were permanent, and each pilot lost reduced the pool of remaining talent. The Americans, in contrast, could replace men and material far more quickly, a fact that added another layer to the calculus of survival. The kamikaze was powerful, terrifying, and temporary, an enemy that demanded respect, but ultimately could be worn down by superior resources and innovation. Finally, the moral and emotional dimension colored every encounter. Sailors faced a paradox. Their enemy was willing to die, yet still human. Letters found on destroyed planes, photographs in pilots' pockets, and the faces of teenagers behind cockpits forced a reckoning. Some gunners hesitated, struck by the youth of their targets. Others steeled themselves, knowing hesitation meant death for their shipmates. On both sides, courage, fear, and determination intertwined in a way rarely seen in conventional combat. The kamikaze was not merely a tactic, it was a moral crucible, testing the resolve of men on both sides of the Pacific. These angles, human, technological, tactical, leadership, enemy, and moral, converged in the skies over Leyte and Okinawa. Each dive, each explosion, each command decision was part of a larger story, a collision between belief and innovation. The stage was set for the decisive encounters, where human sacrifice met the cold precision of technology, and the balance of life and death would hang in the balance. The continuation of the angles begins with a deeper exploration of the human perspective. For the American sailors, the sight of a kamikaze hurtling from the clouds was not just a tactical problem, but a psychological trial. Each approaching plane carried a single purpose: to die on their ship. There was no negotiation, no retreat, no hesitation. Gunners loaded shells with shaking hands, hearts pounding, aware that the slightest miscalculation could mean death. For many young men, the experience was surreal. Smoke, fire, and debris combined into a scene that seemed unreal. Yet each explosion, each scream, reminded them of the stakes. Witnesses would later describe the feeling of watching a plane tear apart mid-air from a VT shell, a strange combination of awe and horror. The human cost of these battles was measured not only in lives lost, but in the psychological weight borne by those who survived. Veterans recalled sleepless nights and the persistent images of planes collapsing into the ocean. For the Japanese pilots, fear was suppressed beneath layers of indoctrination and ritual. Some wrote final letters or prepared tokens for loved ones, small pieces of humanity preserved before embracing death. These acts revealed the tension between devotion and mortality, a tension that defined the kamikaze phenomenon. Technological innovation, however, was the decisive factor in changing the dynamics of these engagements. The 5-inch VT shell did more than explode near the target. It transformed the very rules of naval warfare. Each shell carried a miniature radar system, capable of detecting a plane and detonating at the precise moment to maximize destruction. No human eye could calculate distance and speed accurately enough in the milliseconds available. This invisible intelligence gave American sailors a new sense of control, even against pilots determined to die. Early skepticism had questioned whether electronics could survive the shock of firing, whether the shell would detonate too early or too late. In practice, the results were devastating. Reports describe entire groups of kamikazes being destroyed before reaching the fleet. Planes splintered mid-air as if torn by an invisible hand. The VT fuse was not just a weapon, it was a psychological equalizer. Where human gunners might hesitate or miss, the shell acted with mechanical precision, turning the kamikaze's advantage, their willingness to die, into a vulnerability. Tactically, the VT shell allowed for a new defensive doctrine. Picket destroyers could engage incoming planes at greater distances, forming protective barriers around carriers. Ships' nose longer had to rely solely on evasive maneuvers or massed gunfire, which were both exhausting and inefficient. Radar operators coordinated with gunners, guiding them to focus fire on optimal points along the flight path. This created a layered, automated response that could counter multiple attackers simultaneously. Commanders began calculating engagement patterns based on VT effectiveness, shifting formations to maximize the coverage of each exploding shell. The result was a fleet that could withstand greater numbers of kamikaze assaults with fewer casualties. The invisible intelligence within each shell, combined with human coordination, represented a fusion of technology and strategy unseen in previous conflicts. Leadership decisions shaped the impact of the technology and tactics on the battlefield. Admiral Spruance's insistence on maintaining disciplined firing practices and strict coordination with radar operators proved vital. Other officers, skeptical of new technology, learned quickly that hesitation could cost lives. The Japanese High Command, meanwhile, had placed enormous faith in the power of morale and devotion. Vice Admiral Onishi encouraged successive waves of volunteers, believing that sheer numbers and the shock value of self-sacrifice could overwhelm the Americans. In practice, the collision of Japanese resolve with American technological innovation created a deadly counterpoint. Courage confronted precision. Leaders on both sides had to adjust strategies in real time, recalculating objectives and responses under fire, while their men executed orders in the heat of battle. From the enemy angle, kamikazes were an expression of strategic desperation. Japan's conventional air force had been decimated, leaving no alternative but to send pilots in single-use missions. Each pilot destroyed was irreplaceable, and each failed attack weakened Japan's already agile defensive network. Yet the tactic also carried a hidden flaw. Its success depended entirely on the enemy not countering it effectively. The introduction of the VT shell exploited this flaw, converting suicidal bravery into a calculable liability. Japanese pilots were unmatched in their fearlessness, but American technology had neutralized the advantage of human resolve. In this sense, the kamikaze was a high-risk gamble that, while terrifying, could be countered with innovation and coordination. Morale and emotion remained central to understanding the conflict. On board U.S. ships, crews oscillated between fear and relief, anxiety and pride. Every destroyed kamikaze was a victory, but also a reminder of what could have happened. Sailors grappled with the ethics of destroying someone so young and devoted, yet their survival depended on it. Japanese families, unaware of the precise circumstances of death, mourned while celebrating honor, sustaining the cultural narrative that sacrifice was valorous. The collision of morality, devotion, and survival created a battlefield as much psychological as physical. It was a war where human courage, technological ingenuity, and moral complexity converged in moments measured in seconds, yet remembered for decades. By the time the largest kamikaze waves arrived over Okinawa, the combined effect of these angles was clear. Human bravery was matched by mechanical precision, tactical innovation balanced by leadership, and psychological terror tempered by unseen technology. The VT shell had not only leveled the playing field, but changed the nature of engagement entirely. What was once an unstoppable human weapon became a target easily destroyed before impact. The sky had become a theater where faith and science clashed in stark relief, setting the stage for the decisive moments that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Spring 1945 brought the final, most brutal phase of the Pacific War. Okinawa, the typhoon of steel, became the stage for the largest kamikaze assault in history. For weeks, the island's airfields, carved from hills and jungles, buzzed with activity. Japanese pilots, many barely trained, took off in waves. Each plane carried explosives. Each pilot carried the resolve to die. From dawn to dusk, the skies above the American fleet were filled with the roar of engines, the staccato of anti-aircraft guns, and the screams of ships under fire. The U.S. Navy braced for the onslaught. The destroyer picket line bore the brunt of these attacks. Ships like USS Laffey, USS Bush, and USS Little were positioned miles ahead of the main fleet to detect and engage incoming planes. The sailors on board had faced kamikaze strikes before, but nothing on this scale. Hundreds of planes were sighted each day. Radar blips moved in, forming the arcs of dives that promised death. The VT-fused 5-inch shells were loaded, guns elevated, and gunners steadied their hands. Every shot mattered. Every second counted. The first wave arrived on the morning of April 6, 1945. A flight of Mitsubishi Zeros and Yokosuka D4Ys descended on the pickets. The gunners fired in disciplined volleys, timing each shell to detonate as the planes reached lethal proximity. Explosions ripped through the air. Planes were shredded mid-dive, wings torn, fuselages splintered. One by one, the pilots were denied their fatal contact, their bodies and machines collapsing harmlessly into the waves. The sailors watched in tense relief, yet fear never fully dissipated. The next wave was always coming. On USS Laffey, 93 sailors manned the guns against more than 200 attacking planes. The destroyer was hit multiple times, fires flared, and men were wounded, yet the combination of radar coordination, disciplined gunfire, and VT IOs held the enemy at bay. Reports from that day capture the intensity. "The sky seemed to detonate around us," one gunner wrote. Another recalled, "It was like fighting ghosts who refused to die quietly." Every explosion was proof of the VT fuse's power, yet the chaos of the battle reminded the crew that survival was fragile. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders watched the results with mounting frustration. Vice Admiral Onishi had deployed successive waves, expecting at least some strikes to succeed. The American fleet, however, seemed impervious. The VT shell had become an invisible shield. Every plane destroyed before impact was a psychological blow, and each failed attack eroded the morale of volunteers waiting for their turn. By mid-April, it became clear to the Japanese High Command that the kamikaze, once a terrifying weapon, was meeting its match in technology they could neither see nor understand. The battle also revealed the limitations of the kamikaze strategy. Pilots with damaged planes or miscalculations often crashed into the sea before reaching any target. Fuel shortages and navigation errors further reduced the effectiveness of attacks. Even when planes reached the fleet, the coordinated VT gunfire often split the waves, allowing some aircraft to be destroyed mid-air, while others were forced into less optimal dive angles, reducing their chances of hitting a ship. The combination of skill, technology, and discipline tilted the balance in favor of the Americans, transforming what had seemed like an unstoppable threat into a challenge that could be measured, predicted, and countered. One dramatic encounter involved USS Missouri, the battleship whose massive guns dominated the fleet. Kamikazes approached in formation, banking sharply to avoid anti-aircraft fire. VT shells detonated in mid-air, slicing apart aircraft before they could impact the deck. The sailors on Missouri watched fragments and fire rain into the sea around them. Some planes managed to reach the superstructure, but were neutralized by last-second gunnery. The effect was cinematic, a deadly dance of speed, precision, and destruction. Victory here was measured not in glory, but in survival. The cumulative effect of VT shells was unmistakable. Ship after ship survived dives that would previously have meant disaster. Morale among American sailors rose, while the Japanese pilots faced the grim realization that no amount of devotion could overcome invisible, calculated firepower. Yet the human cost remained high. Even as VT shells destroyed many planes, some kamikazes reached their targets. Ships burned. Sailors died. The Pacific War had become a contest of extremes, human sacrifice against scientific ingenuity. By the end of the first week of April 1945, the nature of the kamikaze threat had fundamentally changed. What had once been the embodiment of unstoppable determination now encountered a force that neutralized it. The invisible hand of the VT shell dictated the outcome of engagements. American fleets could plan, predict, and survive attacks that might have seemed fatal weeks earlier. The stage was set for the final reckoning, where technology and discipline would collide with human devotion in ways both terrifying and decisive. The battle for Okinawa dragged on into late spring, each day a brutal test of endurance. The kamikazes came in waves so dense they seemed endless. Hundreds of planes launched from Kyushu, Formosa, and the Japanese mainland, all converging on the U.S. Fifth Fleet. The sea below was littered with wreckage and oil slicks that burned for miles. Every ship in the area was under constant alert. Every sailor living in the Space B, between duty and dread. The VT-fused anti-aircraft shells had already proven themselves, but this was the moment of ultimate reckoning, where innovation would be pushed to its absolute limit. On April 16, 1945, radar operators aboard the radar picket destroyer USS Laffey once again reported multiple inbound formations. The crew called her the ship that would not die, and today, that name would be tested. At 8:30 in the morning, the first wave of attackers appeared on the horizon. Japanese Zeros and Francis bombers diving in perfect unison. Gunners opened fire immediately. VT-fused shells detonated mid-air, slicing through the oncoming formation. 3 planes disintegrated before they could even enter their dive. But more followed, undeterred, streaking down through clouds of smoke and fire. The air was chaos. The sound of the guns was deafening. The men could barely hear the orders shouted across the deck. Shell casings piled up. The barrels glowed red-hot. Yet amid the noise and confusion, there was method, precision. Every gunner trusted the unseen timing inside each shell. A tiny device, no bigger than a light bulb, decided life and death at that instant. Some shells exploded too soon, scattering fragments into empty air. But most found their marks. The accuracy was unlike anything the sailors had seen before. One gun captain later said, "It was as if the shells could think for themselves." Then, in the smoke-choked sky, one kamikaze broke through the defensive screen. The pilot dove straight for the ship, his plane aflame, smoke trailing behind him like a comet. The gunners tracked him, fired, and missed. Another volley, and just before impact, the plane exploded mid-air, torn apart by an invisible burst. The deck crew ducked as flaming debris showered the ship. When they looked up, the sky was clear again. The men realized they were alive only because of that one perfect detonation. Yet the cost was staggering. USS Laffey was struck 6 times by crashing planes that slipped through the firestorm. Explosions tore through her decks, and fires raged for hours. Still, she did not sink. Damage control teams fought the flames while the guns kept firing, even as water poured into the hull. VT shells continued to burst overhead, forming a curtain of death around the ship. When the battle ended, 32 sailors were dead, but more than 200 attacks had been repelled. Admiral Mitcher later remarked that without the proximity fuse, not a single ship on the picket line would have survived that day. Elsewhere, the same story repeated across the fleet. On USS Cassin Young, USS Aaron Ward, and USS Hadley, kamikazes fell from the sky in blazing arcs. Each time, the VT fuse determined the difference between destruction and survival. The Japanese pilots, many no older than 19, flew straight into a storm of invisible explosions. Some never made it close enough to see their targets. The few who broke through found decks already blackened by smoke, their comrades' burning wrecks floating nearby. For them, the mission was a sacrifice, but for the Americans, It was a grim kind of salvation born from science. By now, intelligence officers aboard the flagship had begun compiling reports. Statistical analysis confirmed what the sailors already knew. Anti-aircraft effectiveness had doubled since the introduction of the VT fuse. For every 100 attacking planes, nearly 60 were destroyed before reaching their targets. Those numbers transformed the psychology of the war. For months, the kamikaze had been the embodiment of terror, a weapon of despair that defied reason. Now, it had met a force equally invisible but few are more rational. Even so, for all its success, the VT fuse was not invincible. Some kamikazes slipped through gaps in the barrage. A Zero hit the USS Missouri's side, its engine embedding in the hull before catching fire. Another struck USS Bunker Hill, igniting the flight deck and killing nearly 400 men. The VT fuse could not stop every plane, but without it, the toll would have been catastrophic. It was not a shield, it was a sword, and even swords must be wielded carefully. By May, the Japanese command was desperate. Fuel shortages, attrition, and radar interception crippled their capacity to launch further attacks. Yet they continued, driven by honor and hopelessness. Pilots performed final ceremonies, writing farewell letters, drinking sake, and cutting locks of hair to send home. The act had become ritual, the outcome inevitable. But against a fleet guarded by radar and proximity fuses, their sacrifice no longer carried the sting of fear it once did. For the men who fought on the ships, the contrast was haunting. They felt respect, even pity, for their enemies, young men dying with conviction, while also feeling awe for the machine that saved their lives. The proximity fuse symbolized more than technological progress. It represented a shift in warfare itself, where emotion met precision, and where science quietly rewrote the terms of survival. When the guns finally fell silent at Okinawa, the scale of the battle was staggering. Nearly 4,000 kamikazes had attacked. 34 Allied ships were sunk, and hundreds were damaged. But without the VT fuse, the losses could have numbered in the hundreds. The weapon had not just saved ships, it had preserved morale, confidence, and the rhythm of advance. It had turned despair into endurance. As reports reached Washington, military analysts and scientists who had worked in secrecy realized the true power of what they had built. The proximity fuse was no longer just an experiment, it was history's turning point. The Pacific War would still claim lives, but the path to victory was now clear. The age of precision warfare had arrived, born not from chance, but from the quiet hum of a tiny transmitter hidden within a shell. When the smoke cleared over Okinawa, the cost of the battle was staggering. Thousands of lives had been lost on both sides. Over 3,800 kamikaze sorties had been launched, with Japanese pilots sacrificing themselves in devotion to their emperor and country. American losses, though significant, were tempered by the invisible shield of technology. 36 ships had been sunk, hundreds more damaged, and thousands of sailors killed or wounded. The VT-fused shells had not eliminated casualties entirely, but they had transformed the nature of survival, providing a level of protection previously unimaginable. Sailors could endure waves of attacks and still see their ships float, fires controlled, and lives spared. Reports from the fleet emphasized the unprecedented effectiveness of the new weapon. Commanders noted that planes were being destroyed before completing their dives, sometimes without a single human hand directly guiding the shot. Sailors described the explosions as both terrifying and awe-inspiring, witnessing the precision of the VT shells as they shredded aircraft mid-air. One account from the USS Laffey described the sky bursting like fireworks, each detonation a saving grace for the men below. These observations confirmed what intelligence officers and scientists had long hoped. The proximity fuse. It was not a gamble, but a decisive tool in naval warfare. The impact went beyond statistics. Morale among American sailors rose dramatically. Before the VT shell, fear of the kamikaze had shaped behavior, forcing evasive maneuvers and constant vigilance. After its deployment, gunners could rely on a combination of human skill and technological precision. Confidence returned, not as arrogance, but as measured assurance. Ships survived encounters that previously would have meant near certain destruction, and sailors witnessed firsthand the invisible hand that protected them. The sense of inevitability once associated with kamikaze attacks diminished, replaced by the possibility of survival and victory. The Japanese perspective, however, was different. The High Command recognized the growing futility of kamikaze operations. Even with meticulous planning and waves of dedicated pilots, losses mounted without corresponding results. Pilots trained for months or weeks were destroyed mid-dive, their sacrifices failing to achieve the strategic objectives envisioned. Diaries, letters, and post-war reflections reveal frustration, sorrow, and despair among officers and families alike. The kamikaze had once seemed unstoppable, but against the VT shell, their resolve collided with invisible precision, yielding results the Japanese could neither predict nor counter. The introduction of the VT shell also altered future tactical considerations. Fleet formations evolved, emphasizing radar integration and coordinated firing. Commanders documented engagement patterns, calculating optimal distances, angles, and shell volumes for maximum effectiveness. These lessons extended beyond Okinawa, shaping how the U.S. Navy approached air defense in the final months of the Pacific campaign. The proximity fuse became more than a weapon. It became a model for modern naval strategy, integrating technology, coordination, and human skill in a seamless defense system. Official post-battle reports later praised the VT fuse as one of the most significant technological innovations of the war. Admiral Nimitz and other high-ranking officials acknowledged its role in saving ships, lives, and momentum during the Pacific campaign. Scientific journals and military analyses emphasized its reliability, the ingenuity of its radar components, and its contribution to minimizing casualties. The combination of secrecy, precision, and deployment strategy had created a weapon that could determine outcomes without fanfare, its success only fully understood after battle reports were compiled and cross-referenced. Yet, even in victory, the human cost was evident. Sailors carried memories of burned decks, wounded shipmates, and shattered aircraft. Japanese families mourned young sons who had embraced death with conviction. The VT shell had saved lives, but it had also borne witness to the extremes of war, the collision of human devotion with mechanical precision. This duality, between sacrifice and survival, defined the aftermath of Okinawa. The war was not over, but the invisible weapon had shifted the balance, demonstrating that technology could decisively counter even the most extreme human resolve. As the months passed following Okinawa, the true scope of the VT shell's impact became clear. American analysts compiled exhaustive reports detailing sortie counts, hits, and destroyed aircraft. Nearly 60% of kamikaze planes were neutralized before striking any target, a staggering rate for a weapon designed to evade conventional defenses. These figures reshaped the Navy's understanding of air warfare. What had once been a psychological nightmare, enemy pilots willing to die without hesitation, was now a tactical problem that could be measured, predicted, and mitigated. The invisible power of the proximity fuse had turned desperation into vulnerability. The Japanese forces, meanwhile, faced the grim arithmetic of attrition. Their pool of trained pilots had dwindled, fuel reserves were almost gone, and replacement aircraft were scarce. Kamikaze operations continued in name, but the efficacy of attacks was declining sharply. Each loss was permanent. There was no room for mistakes or miscalculations. Families and commanders alike began to recognize that the sacrifice, once believed to be pivotal, could no longer stem the tide of American advance. The contrast between the human cost and diminishing returns underscored the limits of devotion against technological superiority. For the Americans, the VT shell became a symbol of precision, reliability, and innovation. Naval officers emphasized its effectiveness in debriefings, and scientific teams studied its deployment to improve future versions. The lessons learned extended beyond Okinawa. Coordination between radar, gunnery, and firing sequences became a standard for anti-aircraft defense. The weapon also demonstrated the transformative power of secrecy and innovation. Its success depended on the Japanese never discovering its mechanism. That unseen advantage allowed sailors to survive encounters that, only months before, might have ended in catastrophic loss. The aftermath also influenced post-war military thinking. Analysts recognized that human-guided attacks could be countered not only by numbers and firepower, but by technology that outpaced reaction time. The proximity fuse foreshadowed the age of guided missiles, electronic warfare, and automation in combat systems. It provided a blueprint for integrating human decision-making with technological precision, a combination that would define modern naval doctrine. Reports circulated among military engineers, emphasizing that the lesson of Okinawa was clear. The next generation of warfare would be dominated by unseen mechanisms capable of shaping the outcome of battles before human reflexes could respond. Despite the strategic success, the human consequences were undeniable. American sailors continued to cope with the trauma of destruction and loss, carrying memories of comrades lost to planes that slipped through the barrage. Japanese survivors and families mourned the young men who had flown without return. The VT shell had not made war painless. It had merely altered the balance between life and death, making survival more likely while confronting all involved with the reality of combat's brutal extremes. In many ways, it highlighted the intersection of human courage, technological ingenuity, and moral reckoning, the duality of heroism and science. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the VT shell had proven its significance. The Japanese surrender marked the cessation of organized kamikaze operations, but the legacy of the weapon endured. Military historians would later describe it as one of the most decisive technological interventions of World War II, a device that saved countless lives, preserved fleet integrity, and shifted the psychological burden away from fear toward measured confidence. Its influence reached beyond the Pacific, inspiring post-war developments in guided munitions, radar-assisted artillery, and precision defense systems. The lessons of Okinawa were clear. Human devotion alone could not overcome technology that operated faster, smarter, and with near-perfect timing. Kamikaze pilots had flown into history, leaving a legacy of bravery and tragedy, but the invisible hand of the VT shell had rewritten it, and the rules of survival at sea. It demonstrated that innovation, secrecy, and precision could alter the balance of power, even against the most extreme human sacrifice. The war would continue to take lives, but the scale of destruction could now be mitigated. The invisible war above the Pacific, fought in milliseconds and flashes of metal, had permanently changed naval combat and the understanding of human versus machine in warfare. The story of kamikaze attacks and the VT shell is a study in contrasts: devotion versus technology, courage versus calculation, human sacrifice versus mechanical precision. Young Japanese pilots climbed into their planes, knowing they would never return, driven by honor, faith, and desperation. Each dive carried the weight of a nation's hope, a culture's code, and a personal resolve to fulfill duty at any cost. Their courage was absolute, unflinching, and terrifying. Yet, in the invisible arcs of detonating shells, science met that courage with a quiet, deadly inevitability. The VT fuse did not tire, hesitate, or misjudge. It acted with perfect timing, neutralizing threats that no human reflex could consistently stop. The Pacific War, and specifically Okinawa, illustrates the collision of human will and technological ingenuity. The VT shell was more than a weapon. It was a turning point in warfare. It demonstrated that even the most extreme acts of devotion could be countered by innovation, strategy, and precision. It changed naval doctrine, influenced post-war weapon development, and redefined the way the military approached threats from the air. The psychological impact was equally profound. Sailors regained a measure of control, a sense that survival was possible even under the most desperate circumstances. Yet the story is also a reminder of the cost of war. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides, countless families mourned, and young men faced death with bravery that defies comprehension. The VT shell could save ships and men, but it could not erase the trauma, the fear, or the moral weight of witnessing human sacrifice. History remembers both the courage of the kamikaze and the ingenuity of those who countered them, each shaping the outcome in ways impossible to separate. Ultimately, the battle between kamikaze pilots and the VT shell embodies the paradox of war, the meeting of human devotion and mechanical precision, the interplay of honor and survival, and the evolution of combat from raw bravery to calculated innovation. It is a story of extremes, of sacrifice, and of the quiet, invisible hand of technology that reshaped history above the waves of the Pacific.